Welcome back to a new episode of Follow the Rabbit, where we decode cultural phenomena and deconstruct emerging trends to help you update your mental model of the world. Trying very hard over here in the Berlin headquarters not to go too much into politics today. Also, it's very tempting to do so. We just rather talk about bigger, more interesting stuff, I'd say. It's staring. I'm Johannes Kleske. With me, as always, is Igor Schwarzman. Igor, say hi. After we talked about a lot of open source, AI, and technology stuff, today we're going to basically the heart of decoding cultural phenomena. We're talking about subcultures, which, if you know anything about what, especially like trend work used to be like, it was all about like going to the subcultures, finding those like niches, seeing what they do early, going to the fringes of culture to see where culture might move sometime in the future. And by this, trying to forecast the horrible word of where trends might move. I think that has changed quite a bit. And we have someone here today who can help us much better understand, I think, how subcultures as a concept have changed and what we can learn from that and what brands and organizations can learn from that and what might actually be like further developments in the future. Igor, you want to tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, as a preparation for this episode, I kind of thought about, this is the nerdy analogy, I thought about Star Trek and how they have this directive where they are not supposed to get in contact with certain cultures and make sure that they observe them from a distance. And I felt like there's probably some framework that we need to put in place as people who work in this field where if we discover a subculture, that we don't post about it before it actually fully develops into something of its own.
So it's a prime directive of the fleet.
Yeah, exactly. But to kind of like, so this podcast was very much triggered by this situation where I read something online, and then I read something online on protein, and then it was an article about with the question, are subcultures dead? And one of the people who had a piece in that kind of thread was Jack. Jack is with us today, Jack Stanley. And he later wrote a little bit more expansive piece on his take on subcultures. And I thought that was really interesting. And since we do have a podcast that kind of is interested in that space, we thought we'll bring Jack on here and let him maybe first introduce himself and then give us a little bit of a primer on his take on what's the state with subcultures and what's happening in that field. Jack, hello.
Great. Hello. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Jack Stanley. I'm a writer and a consultant and researcher in London. Yeah, for a lot of the past kind of couple of years, I've been researching subcultures and what subcultures are today. I think it's very easy to think that social media and the internet killed them, but whether or not that is actually the case, I think is really interesting. And last year I finished my master's at UCL in London in material and visual culture. And I particularly focused on a very niche area, which was bootleg hardcore t-shirts and the market for them and the trade in them. And one of the things that came up in that, which is, I think, the essay that you read, Igor, was about this idea of cultural diffusion, which is kind of, do things get diluted the further you get from the kind of the source, I suppose, or the everyday and the kind of being involved. So yeah, that was kind of the starting point for a lot of my thoughts about subcultures. And I'm still not sure if I have the answer to that question, but I think it's a very interesting way to start thinking about who's doing what, I suppose.
Well, I mean, like, let's dive a little bit into it. Do they get diluted or not? And what is dilution? Or let me put it differently. What does dilution look like, actually?
Yeah, so the paper that I kind of that really opened my eyes to this was by a guy called J. Patrick Williams, who I can't remember where he's a sociologist, and he's like a real old school hardcore guy. He's covered in tattoos. He's got his big tiles in his ears, and he wrote about 20 years ago about the evolution of straight edge, which is kind of for those who don't know, is like a subset of hardcore, where no drinking, no drugs. It's quite like a serious moral component that makes up part of hardcore. What he was writing about was basically he's spending a lot of time in straight edge forums. I assume he is straight edge, but I don't actually know. In kind of like the early 2000s, and straight edge at that point had come to mean no drinks, no drugs. So it was almost like a catch-all term for sobriety, rather than derived from this particular musical scene in America 25 years earlier. So for him, he was arguing that there kind of was an element of diffusion between the two, but also that through accessing this straight edge forum, a lot of people, it may be that's how they found the bigger subculture. So they may have joined this forum because they didn't drink and take drugs, but actually that was just an introduction into something else. And for quite a lot of them, I think he writes that they did end up going to shows, and they did end up being part of a physical community, for want of a better word, rather than just abstaining completely from that and only interacting online. And I think it's interesting about that because I think it's very easy to say that physical participation is essential. That's I grew up in a city and I now live in a bigger city. And that was very easy for me to be part of subcultures and be part of kind of scenes, for want of a better word, that were going on because they were happening 15 minutes away from my house. If you got, on a different continent or even just a different part of the country, then maybe the internet does become a kind of accurate, or certainly the best substitute that you can have.
Yeah, and it actually triggered a memory that I had. I was sitting in a bar in Toronto, and a woman started talking to me, and she was in Toronto for a concert, which she traveled to 2,500 kilometers to, because Canada is just really vast. And I was super, I remember thinking it's incredible how much of a fan she is, but obviously that's kind of relative, because in Canada, traveling 2,500 kilometers is not the same thing as traveling 2,500 kilometers in Europe, where a famous person might stop across every 400 kilometers for a bigger city to perform a concert. But I think in that proximity or density question, there is something about the effort that we need to put into immerse ourselves in a specific kind of subculture, or the effort is kind of the point of being in that culture. And I think that in itself does have some component of, the internet as a vast kind of lowered the bar. It made it a little bit convenient to tap into different things. And I would assume that at least part of the dilution comes from that, the convenience of being able to tap into different subcultures more easily.
Yeah, and I think that these things shouldn't be easy. They should, as you say, there should be a level of commitment. I think it comes down to this idea, and it's a horrible word that means almost nothing, but this idea of authenticity.
Yeah.
Which I will try and
It took us only 9 minutes to get there.
Yeah, it's obviously it's an awful and misused word, but I think that it can be used correctly, basically. There's a lot of stuff about authenticity, and one kind of authenticity being this idea that it's inherent within you, and not to get too kind of theoretical within 10 minutes, but Sarah Thornton wrote this book in the early 90s about kind of rave culture. And she uses the phrase second-naturedness, I think, and this idea that you don't have any choice. If you're into a subculture, that is because there is something within you that you have to express, or you have to live your life in that way. And I think that's the thing about commitment and ease of access, is that we can all go online and listen to something new and watch something new and look at something new every day. It's that idea of you have to be a certain way. And then I think if you have that, then traveling 2,500 kilometers makes sense, because again, you don't see yourself. The idea is that you wouldn't have a choice about doing that. You have to participate. Whereas standing at arm's length is a bit, I can do this, but I can also go and do something different.
Right. I think we not touched on the main points also from your article, and I'm just wondering if we can put it a bit on a timeline, if that makes sense, in the sense of, I think I would also remember from my youth, there were much more stronger, clear identities of you're either this or that. And that was like a subcultural thing. Like you're either with the hip hop heads or you're metalhead or all these others that might not even be connected to music or like a certain culture or something like that. So it was much more
like mean something when you ask someone what kind of music you listen to.
Yeah, there you go.
And that answer provided you a rich tapestry of information that
is
not the case.
Yeah. It also, I mean, it was the same with clothing and things like that. I think there's a lot of like similarities there. Like you wore something because you hunted for it forever, and just people would see and like go, oh shit, you got this, where you got it from. And I remember like the first people in my class who came back with Levi's jeans. It's like, I was, damn. And now it's so much easier. And I'm wondering like if we just like look back, I don't know, like the last 20 years, 30 years, maybe that shows that I'm trying to avoid the conversation of how old I am. That I just only like 25 years. 20 years. It reminds me of the clip of the Insta reel I just saw where sounds like, what is a modern metal classic? And then like, it's this song. Sorry, that's not a modern metal classic. That's just a classic metal song because it's 25 years old.
Someone was telling me that he was at a rock climbing gym, and something by the Strokes was playing.
Yeah.
And there were these like 17-year-olds, and one of the 17-year-olds said, "I love classic rock."
Yeah.
And he kind of had his head in his hands next to him.
There you go. So also, you've done a lot of work for like Hypebeast and all these publications. Just from your own observation, if you like zoom out a bit and look at the last decades of these things evolving, what are like the big picture developments you see, how subcultures and how mainstream culture understands subcultures? How has this changed?
I think the obvious one is obviously Instagram, which is 15 years ago, I think. And that feels like a real, well, also Instagram and then Instagram becoming what it then became. That's a real, suddenly everything was kind of fairly accessible. I think before that, and I think there's a very interesting case study that I don't think anyone's really done about MySpace. And that MySpace was when I was a teenager and getting into music kind of in my own way. And it was huge, and it completely changed music. But I think it changed subcultures on a local level in that you were kind of, I remember people on MySpace being like big. I grew up in Liverpool, and you had kind of big names in the indie scene in Liverpool. It wasn't necessarily an international thing. It kind of somehow maintained a locality to it. So I think that changed it in one way because it made it much easier to stay in touch with people. So you'd meet at a gig or in a certain shop or whatever it was, and then you had that network, and also you could kind of see everything they were into because you tell me your name, for example, if we met at a gig. And then I'd be able to go online and see every band that you liked, every film you've ever seen.
But
or,
the offline thing came first. Like, it's like you follow up. Like, I've met you at the gig or at an event, and then I find you, and then we stay connected.
That's certainly how it felt to me. But yeah, offline, the online was a kind of supplement to offline. I think what happened with Instagram, but again, not when Instagram launched, probably a few years after that. In my head, about 2016, Instagram kind of morphed into this much bigger thing. But I have no evidence to back that out. Then I think online began to replace, or offline would supplement online. And I think there was a switch that happened there. Yeah, and I think that, to go back to that kind of MySpace case study, it was really when like emo was having its big moment over here. Yes. I assume it was the same in Germany. And that to me almost feels with, rose-tinted goggles, like the last kind of version of a subculture that was primarily offline or primarily organic, I suppose. And then, by the time that had, nothing ever kind of really replaced that as so dominant. I think you get this written a lot. Sarah Thornton writes about this a lot about rave culture, and I think Dick Hedges writes about this a lot. But you had kind of newspaper articles almost every day about this peril that was gripping our kids, and it was about them listening to My Chemical Romance. It was, you don't really get that in the same kind of mass way anymore. The kind of, I suppose, the dominant culture speaking about the subculture. And so I think, those two kind of technological moments of MySpace and Instagram, I think were quite interesting markers for what was changing.
It's an interesting, I mean, I keep thinking about my satiric thing where I feel like Instagram was basically the inversion of that rule. It's like basically reveal all the subcultures to everyone all at the same time. And it's a little bit like Schrödinger's cat, but the cat is always that. And I think it's, the question for me is how do, like, I mean, we do see a reemergence, for example, of physical kind of sociality happening. Like we did a whole series about third places being a term that is coming back strong, or kind of like at least it did for like last year. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but there are a lot of like social clubs. People are going like, you know, to reading experiences. People are going to chess clubs, having apparently a boom in the US. So that was
about to be my example as well, was chess clubs.
Right.
So there we go.
Yeah. Well, and it feels like there is at least the need and that people feel, or at least I mean, it's very hard to not generalize, but I think at least a substantial kind of like need is reflective in those numbers that people are joining those kind of like activities that tells us that we maybe do not want to do everything in public, and thus a new form of subculture can form where chess clubs are becoming kind of the new subculture kind of scene. Do you think there is a rejection of kind of the convenience of connecting online?
I don't know about convenience, because all of these things, while they happen physically, are arranged online. So I think the convenience thing is almost, they still have the convenience of being online, because, you know, I can go on Instagram and see when the run club is going and know when to. It's not like you're getting into a kind of secret world. But I think there's definitely a rejection of, or certainly a return to being in person and realizing that that is an important part of how you interact and how you engage with things, and also how you meet people. And I think with all these examples, there's also the kind of the element of health, I suppose, and less drinking. And what can you do? I mean, in the UK for so long, you just went to the pub. That was essentially the only way that you saw people. And now it's this really nice thing that, you know, you can go for a run, or you can go to a chess club, and there are other things to do. So I think that's a huge part of it. But I think they are maybe, to go back to my point about MySpace versus Instagram, they are all subcultural. They have certain subcultural elements, and they are using technology and online is supplementing the physical real world again, rather than the inverse. So I think they still use that convenience of Instagram or social media, but they use it to support something real, which I think is definitely a more interesting route to take. And also, the thing that annoys me slightly about it all is that you still see 100 pictures from each one. It's not, you know, I think that's the idea. And about a lot of kind of music-based subcultures is that it was about kind of release as well. So that's very hard to do if people are filming and taking pictures and all of that. Whereas a lot of these ones, people still take pictures and they'll post it. I think that's maybe a difference between the two as well.
Yeah. There's also a little bit of an economics thing that is happening in the new kind of version of third places that we have seen in our research. So even a club like Reading Rhymes, for example, which is like a New York-based thing where people meet to read a book that they bring to the place, and they would read it for an hour and then talk to a stranger about it. But even that has a subscription service. It's not a thing that's happening kind of like in the community for the community, and people are, I'm not sure if people are more reluctant to do something for others in terms of just putting in the time to organize something, or that they can't afford it anymore and thus basically need to make sure that even those activities that are aimed at building communities and subcultures and kind of just new forms of people getting together need to be always financed somehow, or maybe we just forgot how to do things without thinking about business models.
I think it's probably a combination of them all.
Yeah.
I do think there is I think that these things were cheaper, just generally. I'm really interested in kind of merch as a category, and how every single thing that you're interested in, you can buy a cap or a t-shirt to show that. And that's a way to make money. I think part of it is that these things are more expensive. I think the other part of it is people realize they can make a bit of extra cash, and that people will pay it. And I think it is sad, but also, in a lot of subcultures, that's always existed in a kind of smaller way. And to go back to the dissertation I wrote last year, that's where bootleg t-shirts came from. It would be a fan outside a show who had printed 50 t-shirts. So they were always trying to make a bit of cash. I don't think we should romanticize that. But I think there were also just more, it still felt more by the community for the community. I think with a lot of subscription services, it feels a bit, is that by the community for people on the outside. So that we can all kind of have one eye on what's going on, or, so that we can be aware of it, rather than, and again, this goes back to social media, because if I was selling 25 t-shirts outside of a show in 1991 or whatever, I couldn't tell anyone about that really. They would just see me outside the show. If I'm posting about this merch I've made for my book club on Instagram, that could be seen theoretically by anyone, anywhere in the world. So I think an element of it is just that visibility.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a t-shirt by a flower shop in San Francisco. So, and
yeah, I got some olive oil merch the other day. So I can't talk.
Grasso olive oil.
No, Psyche Organic, if you know that.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, very cool olive oil. I'm not going to give them another free shout out, but yeah, really good stuff.
I'm only wearing a merch from a small bakeries.
There we go.
Like a small sourdough bakery from Marseille. That's what I wear.
But maybe let's explore that, because there's, I mean, on the one hand, obviously there's this commercialization point of view, and like, let's stick to the bakeries, for example. The thing is that what did kind of came out of all of this is that the merch is actually really great, right? It's like, it's well designed. It's like, it's on a good t-shirt. People kind of make them on organic cotton shirts, and one t-shirt from one bakery in Marseille doesn't mean that you're actually a fan of that bakery. But having 10 different shirts from 10 different bakeries does mean that you kind of love sourdough in a maybe problematic kind of way, which is kind of like the point. So I think there's like that kind of like juxtaposition of like, when is it enough that when did I buy enough stuff to actually mean it?
Yeah. I suppose, what does it, when everything is available to anyone, what does it mean to have one t-shirt from a bakery that you've never been to, or a flower shop? I always think, I've been thinking and kind of not really packaging my thoughts on this for a couple of years about the kind of the age of merch, which I think we're either in or past the peak of now, versus kind of like cultural capital and Bourdieu and distinction. And what does it mean about our tastes and our interests when we are essentially shouting them at every opportunity? And is that just, I was emailing someone this morning who is a year below me was a year below me on my master's, about her dissertation. And it's this idea about Instagram and merch, and your taste is just constantly on show, rather than in this kind of more subtle way of acting, kind of behavior type that Bourdieu wrote about, that we are now saying, I have completely exquisite, immaculate taste because I'm wearing this t-shirt from this art gallery that you've never heard of. And I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition between cultural capital and subcultural capital and distinction, and how easy it is to wear a logo on a t-shirt.
I think it's super fascinating because it ties in so well with our conversation with Kyle Chaika about taste, curation of taste. And that always brings us back to the notion of identity. And that again then brings us back to subcultures, because those used to be like the sources of identity. This is like how you define your whole identity, is by what subculture you're part of and how committed you are to that. I also have to constantly think, like, when you talk about like the age of merch, like when we started this podcast with Life After Lifestyle, and Toby Shorin talks about this notion of, it used to be that like sports brands would sponsor run clubs or have their own run clubs, basically just to like as a campaign, as communications. And then these like these run clubs, self-organized run clubs would emerge, they would start to form like an identity. Then they would start to do merch for the members. And then they would turn that merch into a brand that came out of this. And so it's so fascinating. Maybe you can talk a bit about, because I also find that part in your article really interesting, of the connection of brands and subcultures, because it also goes way back. And there's always been brands who try to like jump on top of subcultures, getting rejected by them. Now we see brands emerge out of subculture instead of they just trying to appropriate it. Where do you see this dynamic?
Yep. I feel like wearing UVU means you're open for running, but also maybe fucking.
Okay. Yeah, I think with the brands and subcultures thing, there's an example I can never actually find, but I really vividly remember, probably from about 15 years ago, which was Topshop doing a collaboration with some sort of really underground rave in New York that had kind of had 3 raves and was getting a bit of buzz, and then suddenly it's in every Topshop window across the UK. And that's an example, I think, of, again, like subculture, and it's kind of the link I wanted to make in that essay was about subcultural diffusion, also the role that brands can play when they get it wrong. I think that when brands can access and use subcultural capital, it's an incredibly valuable tool for brands, and it really works. When they get it wrong, the brand is worse off, the subculture is worse off, kind of no one emerges well. I think your point about brands coming out of subcultures is really interesting, and exactly that. It can never be a top-down thing almost, because that's when, to go back to that word, that's when it comes across as inauthentic. People see through it. Whereas brands who emerge from within a scene or a culture and are, maybe they do reach a wider audience, but they're still firmly rooted in the actual practices of that subculture. So maybe they are paying for events. Maybe they are doing fashion shows at a certain place or using music from someone within that. And it all feels quite for the subculture by the subculture. They just happen to have also been selling much more than that. But I think, again, if you look at kind of traditional luxury brands, and I think a lot of them have lost this and got it wrong, they've always actually been selling cultural capital. And even some of the ones who do it well now, I talk about the Row quite a lot, because they almost every second picture on their Instagram or on any communication is something to do with architecture, photography, or design. It's nothing to do with the clothes. And what that is really saying is you're buying into this world, this kind of shared world of taste. It's really interesting when you apply that to a subcultural setting, and you see brands. I think Heaven by Marc Jacobs actually does this really well, where they are posting about things or they did a pop-up for a kind of S&M leather brand in their London store, which is so the opposite of what the Row are doing. But also they are saying, here is this shared world of taste that we are into and you're into. They have a permanent space in there of Jerks, which is like an amazing vintage t-shirt kind of ephemera shop there in Heaven. It's this really interesting complete parallel or complete mirror image, I suppose, to that traditional luxury idea. But it's doing exactly the same thing of, here is this world that we are a part of, and if you shop here, you are also a part of. But it's not, fine art and still music. It's S&M and metal or something. So it's quite interesting.
It's going to be the title for the episode.
Oh God.
No, but I mean, that's also something that Dover Street Market is basically also doing, like curating those environments in which you can participate in different cultures, even before you knew that you wanted to participate in them. You might have come in for one brand, but you end up being on a different floor, immersed in something completely different. Clothes, but also with the art installations that they have in those spaces, they're kind of curating those ways of exploring, both in a meaningful way, but also in a very, very commercial way, obviously.
Yeah, and I think that's the interest. I mean, I think definitely over the last 35 years, but even maybe more recent than that, this idea that, and I think this goes back to something you were saying earlier, this idea that commercialism is the enemy of subculture, I think, has gone. And, when I'm in my early 30s, and when I was growing up and going to see bands or playing in bands, selling out was an insult. Whereas, now if you're a musician, not everyone, but, the goal is to be in a Nike campaign. Whereas Then even before that, I listened to an interview with someone, I can't remember who, and he spoke about turning down $1 million to be in a print American Express campaign that was only going to be in one magazine because that was against the ethos of the band he was in. Whereas now, everyone's doing that. So I think part of that is just that, we've accepted that commercializing it is okay. Part of it is also that, we don't pay for music anymore.
Yeah.
Hardly anyone pays to go see live music anymore. Yeah. So maybe actually buying a t-shirt or being in a campaign for a sportswear brand is the only way that anyone in media can make money. And this is just a grubby trade-off that we're all happy with.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So you have this one line in the article that really stuck with me, where you say it comes down to commitment. A brand needs to be long-term and committed in a certain space rather than jumping around so that those cracks never appear. That I found really interesting. And I find it especially interesting because I feel this is also what we do as consumers, which from my observation, I see a huge difference to what subcultures used to be, which I hinted to earlier, is like subculture was like you were part of it and you were part of one. Like when I was a hip hop head, I definitely wasn't a metal head. And everything from my clothes to my CD library all would have made clear, like, I'm committed to this one thing. And now we have this notion of like micro identities. Well, like I like this, and I like this. Like we curate our identity out of all these like little identities that we put together. So the one thing that we are not anymore as consumers are committed. Like, so, well, only to a certain extent, where like, yeah, I support this artist and this artist, but there's not really like a connection to that. So I would be really interested in like your observation on that. Is that actually possible anymore? Do we don't even really have subcultures anymore? Have they been replaced by micro identities? Are we basically in the age of not being able to commit anymore because we want to have all the options open and things like that?
Dating.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I think the commitment thing is fascinating because I think there's just a reluctance to commit, to go all in on one thing. And I'm sure there must still be, kids who are doing that, but it's also all right because, I think I probably did that to an extent and kind of erred on the sides a lot, but if I had changed entirely the way I dressed when I was 19, there would have been almost no record of how I dressed. I was joking that I dyed my hair black when I was about 14, and the only record of that is a family holiday that I've ruined all the pictures of with my terrible hair. Whereas now, you will have a digital archive of essentially everything you've ever done.
Right.
So I think that it's really interesting that you can jump around, even though you have evidence of how you used to look. Whereas there's a reason that people talk about moving away to university and reinventing yourself. It's because you have a clean break. Whereas now, I don't know when you get that clean break necessarily. So I think, I hadn't really thought about what impact that must have had on people's ability or willingness to commit. I just think that it's a self-fulfilling kind of loop in that because you don't need to, people don't. I talk all the time about a couple of years ago, probably about 5 years ago, I was sat in the barber's getting my hair cut and there was a kind of music venue over the road. And I remember saying to the barber that I don't say back in my day, but 10 years before, whenever it was, if you looked at a queue for a concert, you could say almost exactly what type of music it would be. You could say, this be, as you say, this be a metal show, this be a hip hop show, this be whatever. We even write down to kind of fairly micro genres. You looked at that crowd and it was almost like every single genre was represented in that line because actually that clothing element didn't matter anymore. And I think that's the interesting bit, is this idea that you can, and I think this goes back to what you're saying about micro-identities and whether or not subcultures exist. You can cherry pick all these different bits from all these different worlds. And then I suppose it constructs a completely individual identity rather than a shared identity. And I think that's really the crux of the do subcultures still exist conversation, that it is not about, a completely, I'm into X, therefore I'm also into all these other things. It's now, I'm into this and this and that. And in one way, that's obviously positive that people can choose whatever they want. But also I think something is lost of that kind of, this idea of a shared world of taste. And I think a big part of that comes from how we learn about things. I'm definitely at the younger end of this, but I still remember every Wednesday after school, I would go and buy my copy of NME, which was really in its last throes as a print magazine then. And you would read interviews with people. And in their interview, a band that you liked would say, we were inspired by this film. And then you'd go and read anything you could about that film. And then that director or this artist or this other musician. I remember reading about The Strokes when that kind of happened the first time. And that sending me off to listen to X that ended up with me finding the Smiths and, all this stuff and kind of going back through cultural history. Now that all of cultural history is essentially a kind of flat plane that you can just dip in and out of whenever you want, I think there is less commitment to find things, and therefore there is less reward when you find them, I think is the thing. So you don't need to commit at all.
Yeah. It's so easy to access. It's so easy to access that you don't have to put in any effort anymore. And that's why you also don't make the effort. You don't have the appreciation anymore, and thus you never go down the rabbit hole.
And this idea that when you found something, as if it was a secret, kind of discovering someone like the Smiths, who had been 15, 20 years earlier the biggest band in the world, or the biggest band in Britain, and feeling like you were the only person in the world who'd ever heard of them because none of your friends maybe had, or they were listening to something else, and then you're kind of discovering these things separately but also together. And that would be how you'd make friends with people at school purely because of the music they listen to. And I think that's gone.
Well, let me test something with the both of you, really. But because I think there's on the one hand, we have a frictionlessness that is kind of hindering us from putting in the kind of energy that we need to put in to fully commit to a thing, so that we can expose ourselves, put in the time. But I think it is in a way connected to a different form of friction, and that is being distraction. So as you said, when you kind of read something about the Strokes, it kind of led you on this path, and it was far less likely for you to get distracted on that path because the availability of everything in your palm wasn't quite there, and you can kind of focus on being enamored and being kind of just focused on the Strokes and everything that's connected to it. So now we are basically the friction that we experience now is the ability to make micro decisions all the time. Do I like this coffee? Where do I I can't go to a coffee place without having looked it up whether or not it's a good one. Suddenly I have my phone in my hand and I don't really remember what I wanted actually to do. But here's this thing that kind of there's a notification from Instagram. And now I'm interested in a flower shop in San Francisco, despite the fact that what I actually wanted to do is really kind of read something about the Strokes at the library. But so basically there's a new friction down, and that is distraction. And that kind of focus that we can gain by having, slow media, if you want, really kind of distracts us from expressing the things that we truly want. And to maybe fine-tune it a little bit, because I also was kind of very focused on that line that Johannes mentioned, wondering how much is kind of the thing that we actually wanted to do, and how much micro-identities do we want, and how much is it that we need to have them as a form of expression because the bar is so lowered, because it's so easy to have those different identities. So, I'm very mindful of the fact that we're three, white dudes and in a specific kind of age group. But at the same time, I do wonder if just things happen too fast in a way because the bar was so lowered so far.
I think it's the idea of the bar being low, micro-identities. The idea that a lot of these things are identities or micro-identities is the issue. And I think that people like something and therefore it becomes a part of their identity rather than just a thing that you like. You know, which cafe you go to. The number of people, when I meet people who, you know, maybe we live in the same area, first question is, you know, which pub do you go to? Which cafe do you go to? Genuinely the one that's closest to my house. And that's why I go. It happens to be very nice, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a fundamental part of who I am. And I think that's the thing with so much. This is obviously you can like whatever, you can have a favorite cafe. That's good. We all should have our places that we like to go, but I don't think you need to be that person. You don't need to, that doesn't need to necessarily become a huge part of who you are. But I think that's kind of the issue with, because the barriers are so low to these things becoming micro identities, we are weaving them all into this kind of patchwork of who we are, when actually a lot of these things are just things that we like, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be. But I think that's also because with Instagram and social media, we are, whether or not we realize it, and we're all kind of active or aware of that. Obviously, a lot of people just aren't. That's great. Active or aware of that world. We're all, I think, subconsciously packaging things into some sort of personal brand constantly. Whereas you just don't need to. And that's obviously the very, like, I'm as guilty of that as anyone. I'm not saying I am, you know, particularly enlightened about it, but I think these things don't need to be part of your identity. It can just be that you like to go running, or you like to go for a coffee, or you like to go to a certain restaurant. It doesn't need to be that you are kind of, that is a fundamental part of who you are and how you express yourself.
I think there's so much interesting stuff in there that I'm wondering why we're doing this. So that there obviously seems to be such a strong urge to find an identity. So you try, when you just talked, like my mind went to, maybe it's not micro identities, maybe we're just prototyping identities. Like we're just trying them out. Like, oh, well, let's see if that's part of it. That's part of it. Which could also be the reason, because it's hard to say what sticks. So for me, sometimes I have this hypothesis that subcultures is what's happening after the hype, because whenever somebody or a group of people trying out something new, it's getting like discovered so fast, blown up as a micro trend, and then like 5 days later it's gone already. And so you're always like, okay, the hype comes first, and then whoever sticks around when the hype train left the station, then it's actually where the slower community building happens, and you see like who's still here, who's still actually feeling connected to that. And I think that's might be how it has changed right now. But I'm always coming back to the question of like, what does identity mean today, and what do we think should be part of that, and what do we feel our surroundings tell us should be part of that?
It's a very big question. I think your idea that the subculture, what happens after, is very interesting. I always think there's an idea of, I think a scene, for example, can only exist in retrospect. And I think it's kind of a similar element to that I think while you're in it, you're just doing it. You're just doing what you like to do. It's only when you take a step back, maybe a year later, a week later, whatever it is, and you see that something bigger has been happening. And generally, those things are all asserted by someone outside, because I think you actually need that step of remove to see that there is a wider cultural thing happening. If you're just in it, then you're not necessarily paying attention to that.
Or if you're paying attention, that means you're constantly, is this it? Is this it? Is this how we do it? Is this it? And it actually doesn't happen, because you're so overthinking it while you're doing it that it never really can be something authentic and unique.
Yeah, and I think you said something earlier about kind of we're all just searching for identity or looking for an identity. And I think that's the interesting kind of subculture, or you could apply to so many other things. So many of these identities are individual based rather than shared identities. I think that's a kind of an endless loop of, because these identities are individual based, we're looking for an identity. The identities that we find are individual based, so it keeps going round and round.
Yeah, I mean, that's there is a conversation between Kyle Chike and Ezra Klein on his book, and actually Ezra mentioned something where he kind of coined the term personal culturescapes, in which we end up listening. And I like, my way of thinking about this, that we have to listen to individualized, algorithmically defined songs that are all the same as all the other people listen to, but ours are our individual versions of that. And I think it's also like there are a lot of, like, Tim Wu in his article about convenience in 2018 mentions that the Walkman is basically the first kind of device that kind of started us on that path of being individualized, because it was a mobile thing that we can take music with us, but we are not just taking music with us, we're also basically pushing everyone out because it's only us listening to that music. And a couple of decades later, we have like AirPods that we don't take out when we talk to other people, which allow us to always kind of manifest this idea of that I need my personal space and I need my thing. And it's interesting because in a way, subcultures had a similar function, or maybe still do. I guess that we're inconclusive in what that is, but the ideal state is that they actually give you a sense of belonging, right? They give you the freedom of identifying yourself with a certain culture. And when you are surrounded by people at a hardcore concert, you know that you can behave in a specific way and nobody will judge you. And you kind of like, that's the whole point. Like, the cognitive load isn't there because you're surrounded by people who are all doing the same thing. And this becomes increasingly harder to have, right? That moment of clarity, of belonging, of not having to think how you actually express yourself, because there is just one way to express yourself. It reminded me a little bit of that meme about running, where there's a guy coming in, like in the 90s running to, like, he says to his kind of like guy with whom he's like living, he's like, I'm going for a run. And he's just kind of like wearing like a piece of plastic, really. And today, like this new version, he's actually running in UVU clothes. And he kind of like needs to photograph himself all the time.
Pre-workout.
When the run was deleted, he's like super upset, because the whole point of the run was to actually have material to show to everyone else.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm not like a hardcore guy. I'm obviously interested in it and I like it. But I went to I guess you'd say a hardcore show on Friday night, and it was great. And you really felt like you were kind of in that community. And then every single person I know who was there, including me, posted about it on Instagram afterwards. Even while we were there, we felt, I remember feeling as I left about how that felt like a real community thing. But then maybe 15, 20 Instagram stories by the time I'd sat down for a drink afterwards from different people. So it's still, even these things that feel very organic are still being packaged up, even unintentionally.
Yeah, it's hard to break out of that thing, right? It's hard to not want to tell other people that I'm part of a community.
Yeah.
Which is kind of strange, because on the one hand, it obviously allows people to participate or be curious in what you do and be curious about their community. But when everyone is doing the same thing and everyone posting about all the different communities, how do you actually how do you connect to something? And I mean, that is relevant to brands these days as well. I mean, we can probably talk about the reason why Nike starts working with Skims and Kim Kardashian, because they are not trusting themselves to actually create culture the way they used to. But and I kind of almost feel sorry for them, because it is hard for a brand like that is kind of known for dominating culture and like creating and shaping it to continue doing so, because the expectation is they actually can.
Yeah, and I just don't know almost anything about this. I just saw a headline that Adidas are launching a second brand as well.
I didn't know.
And I think we're in this point where it's easier. I suppose, the kind of the idea of turning around the tanker.
Yeah.
I mean, these brands are so big, and kind of understandably, it's really difficult for them to actually change direction. And it's easier to launch a whole new brand than it is to kind kind of, as you say, kind of dictate culture anymore. But that's also, I suppose, something. Obviously, Skims is not a small independent brand, but it does feel like the small independent brands are the ones who dictate culture. The issue is that and again, it goes back to subcultures. Whereas previously, a subculture may have had, or a small brand may have had months or years to kind of grow and evolve and become what it was. Now everyone is so desperate for the new thing that, within a couple of weeks, you could have started a brand and sold it or collaborated with one of these people because they're just looking for anyone doing anything interesting.
Well, that restaurant that Johannes and I last went to, the pizza place, that actually started doing communication before the place was open to kind of create momentum. And I think that's also that's how economics work today. By having an audience, you have business. You don't have a business, you don't have audience because you have a good business. And I mean, it reminded me also about this. I don't know his name anymore, but there used to be a guy who was actually selling really expensive T-shirts, band T-shirts of band that didn't exist. By being in the right store, he managed to get an audience for those kind of things. And I mean, they do exist because they're on a T-shirt, right?
Yeah.
It's it's not.
Well, I mean,
they don't
the language of merch is just bizarre. That you can put anything on a T-shirt, and as long as there's generally a small logo on the front and a big logo on the back, we all know exactly what it is or what it's trying to be. And it's, that can be a flower shop, it can be a band, it can be 3 words that I've just come up with. It can be the name of a book. It can be absolutely. I think that's, to go back to the age of merch, that we all immediately understand what that code means.
Yeah.
Even if we don't know what the product it's talking about is.
Yeah. Well,
fantastic.
I think that's a good endpoint, really, or at least a semi-good endpoint. It's unconclusive, but I hope that we at least provided a small outline of things happening right now and how it feels. Well, first of all, how it feels to do the kind of work that we're all doing, but at the same time, also that fluidity and the push and pull between, I would say, a certain form of nostalgia, but at the same time, also a longing for commitment, as Johannes was saying, a form of being kind of immersed in something that provides the comfort of the ways that subcultures used to do. We thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please read Jack's article. We'll link to it in the notes, but also recommend the episode to someone who you think that should listen to it. Until next time, thank you both, Johannes and Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good one.